Without further ado, you're here to see Pen Testing a City from Greg Conti, Tom Cross, and Dave Raymond. So please give them a warm round of applause. Thank you.
And we'd like to thank SimCity Godzilla as well for his help. Hi, I'm Greg Conti. This is Dave Raymond and Tom Cross. Thank you for joining us at Pen Testing a City. Before we get started, we're here as free citizens. We don't represent any employers. We're also not lawyers, and please, if you're going to pen test anything, especially a city, please talk to your lawyer first. So, Tom?
Hey, I'm Tom Cross. I'm the CTO of Drawbridge Networks. Previously worked at Landcope and IBM X-Force Research. Done a lot of vulnerability research over the years.
My name is David Raymond. I was most recently faculty at West Point, where I did cybersecurity education and research, and just transitioned now. I'm doing the same thing at Virginia Tech.
And I'm Greg Conti. I'm currently at West Point, where I'm a faculty member and security researcher, and I'll be transitioning from the Army next summer. Okay, so cities, why are they important? Well, what really motivated us in this, to give this talk, to conduct this research, was that we're good at penetration testing and analyzing security properties of individual products and businesses of varying degrees of scale. But when you think about what keeps countries, nations secure, and what really where civilization thrives, it's based on cities. And there's a big delta between securing a company and securing a city, and we want to take a look at that. And as part of that, we've had some really unique access inside the workings of several major cities and talking to some of their security professionals about their challenges. So that helped inform with real world insights into the research we were doing. Yeah, and when you think about cities, they're microcosms of nations, really, to explore best practices. So if we can start figuring out how to scale from the techniques and strategies that will allow us to go from pen testing a large company, to pen testing a city, then we can start thinking about how to secure nations. That was the idea, and if we can figure out those insights, then maybe perhaps they'll generalize, not just in the United States, but we can figure out how then to pass this around to other cities, share the results. Well, you think about the thin veneer of civilization, right? It doesn't take much to tip over civilization, and it's hard enough to keep things working without there being an adversary. You think of 2 inches of snow and a bad weather call or two down in Atlanta paralyzed the city. You can think the New York City blackout that caused rioting, the earthquakes, and it goes on and on. So Dave, you had an example for Baltimore.
So one thing we'll be talking about is the potential for cascading failures when a failure in one infrastructure causes cascading failures in other infrastructures. One good example is from 2001 when a commuter train derailed in a train tunnel in Baltimore. And of course, it caused the expected delays in commuter train traffic and in automobile traffic in the surrounding area. What also happened during that derailment was a water main was broken, and it caused localized flooding, which flooded power substations and caused power to go out for most of the city for about a day. What happened was there was a small fire associated with the derailment, and it severed fiber optic cables that really controlled communication between some major companies on the eastern seaboard. So it caused disruption in network communications all the way from New York City down into Washington, D.C. So here's an example of a fairly localized event that can cause cascading failures really throughout the infrastructure sectors.
And as another example, we're thinking about scenarios like that are happening by accident. Well, we've had throughout the last few years, or really many years, the InfoSec community's done some great research and provided point cases on vulnerabilities in cities. And one of my favorite stories, I don't know if I call him a hacker, not a vulnerability researcher per se in a conference, but a teenager in 2008 developed, basically hacked the tram system using a modified television remote control and derailed a train in his hometown in Poland. Just as a hobby project, and that was a teenager. So we'll talk a little bit more about what the implications of like the individual, relatively small scale research that people are doing, and that what could be built upon that, because it's hard enough to keep cities running. Tom.
I mean, as you all know, Chris Valasek and Charlie Miller successfully did a remote, full control of an automobile, and there are 1.4 million automobiles, I think, that were vulnerable to that attack. And that's certainly not the only vulnerability like that. And so if you can cause that sort of cascading failure with a derailed train, imagine what you could do with a well-placed sport utility vehicle. A lot of the scenarios that for years we've sort of dismissed as maybe science fiction scenarios or risks that were sort of overblown, we're now getting into a point in time where those things are becoming more and more realistic.
So one good place for us to start is to just think about what we mean by the term city. And turns out, even though we all have sort of an intuitive understanding of what a city is, it's fairly difficult to define. And so we Googled it and got this decidedly poor definition, particularly the second informal version of the definition. A little more digging led to some pretty good attributes, things that you could use to describe a city. And really, a city is, as we think of it, as a large town, municipal area. It could also be a tribal area. There are sort of different versions of what a city might be, but for our purposes, a city has to, for it to be something that we're concerned about, it has large-scale network infrastructure composed of probably critical infrastructure, non-critical infrastructure, maybe many businesses, and then some sort of a municipal network architecture. And even with that, fairly clear definition, there are broad differences between cities. If you just look at population alone, cities might range from a few thousand people to tens of millions of people. So if you look at this chart, it just shows populations of some large municipalities around the world. Tokyo with almost 40 million people, the largest city in the United States, New York City, has only half that, and numbers obviously can go down from there.
So there are different ways, and we're going to talk about how there are different ways of defining a city. Often cities are defined based on a particular county or administrative region. We also tend to think about metropolitan areas. When you think of New York City, you think of the whole place and not just, it's not just the 5 boroughs necessarily. And so the United States being what it is, the best way to decide how big a city is in this country is to look at the television viewing audience. And that's what marketing professionals do. And they have these metro area DMA codes that represent the television viewing population for a particular metro area. And actually, these DMA codes are used often in online marketing, and they're used in the GeoCities database to indicate the metro area that a particular IP block is in. So I took a look at how many IP addresses were assigned to the 10 largest DMA metro areas in the United States. And what's interesting is that the geography of cyberspace is often different than that of the real world. I don't know why Houston has so many IPv4 addresses. If any of you do, please talk to me after the talk. And of course, you can see that IPv6 deployment is radically different at different stages in different metro areas. So,
good. And you see various trends. And one of the trends right now is cities, particularly those that characterize themselves as smart cities or aspire to be smart cities, employing networks of sensors to help them gather data, analyze the data, and provide better services for their people. And also, for example, provide more energy efficiency. With that comes, though, I think as everyone in the room would recognize, that when you bring on additional technologies, that really increases the attack surface. And you can see as well that industry is aware of the opportunity in smart cities and just cities of all types. I mean, I tend to think of cities as there's dumb cities, there's moderately intelligent cities, and there's smart cities. There's a whole spectrum there. But so industry has recognized this, and here are just 3 examples of groups that are looking to provide products and services. Here, example, Cisco's Smart Connected Communities, IBM's Intelligent Operations Center, and recently Google's Sidewalk Labs. So it's drawing the attention of industry as well. And I already mentioned dumb cities, but I wonder, it would now be a good time for a question. Who still has a Honeywell 1950s era thermostat on their wall?
Good choice.
Okay, so good choice because you're probably a lot safer. Is your home decorated like that? Okay. Okay, now moving on to like what it really means to try and think about pen testing of something the scale that we're talking about. Well, we began our analysis looking at, and this is for those of you familiar with SANS, this is SANS 560. They have their penetration testing methodology, and it works, you know, in a certain scoped environment, it works, right? But how does something like this scale up, or where do you begin when you're thinking at city scale? And another piece is, you know, it's not just network penetration tests. We have basic building blocks of traditional pen testing. You think a network penetration test, physical penetration test, a web application penetration test, or a human/software engineer. So those are the basic building blocks that you might have to work with. Again, how do you prioritize? How do you focus those efforts?
So we decided to start with the SANS framework and build upon a framework that looks at some of the intersections that Dave was talking about earlier in his Baltimore example. So, you know, traditional SANS process starts with, you know, understanding the scope of the pen test and then auditing the technical surface area and then doing a risk analysis and a report for the client. In our case, we start with the same place. We define the scope, like what is a city? We talked about the fact that there are different ways of defining that scope. And then we audit the attack surface. Cities have unique attack surfaces that don't exist within organizations, so we're going to take you through that layer by layer. And then once we've identified the point vulnerabilities in that attack surface, we really need to start looking at what the intersections are between those point vulnerabilities that can cause the sort of cascading failures that Dave was referring to. And we look specifically for pressure points that you can push on that can cause those dominoes to start falling. And then on top of that, you can then build your your risk analysis, you can assess what threat actors are interested in pushing those buttons. And that gives you a more sort of comprehensive understanding of what the risks are to a complex system like a city. So, you know, the first step here is that we're going to dissect the surface area of the city and talk about those different surface areas, and then we'll go through the cross-sectioning, pressure point, and risk analysis.
So, and we have to understand that cities themselves, it's not just the local, it's just not the local government. The local government is riding herd over a loose coalition of the willing and unwilling to try and make the city function. Here's an example from San Francisco. So you have the local government, but they've got 200,000 commercial entities, thousands of nonprofits, and a population of 837,000 plus or minus. So that, I mean, that's the complexity that you're looking at, and it's an important aspect is it's not just not the government itself. You have to think about all the interdependencies, all the interconnections between these disparate groups. And then just a quick look at what, if you want to think about protecting a nation in the United States using statistics that from there, there's 39,000 cities. 1.5 million nonprofits, 27 million small businesses, and then you get into hundreds of millions of smartphones, personal computers, and people, and potentially billions with the emerging Internet of Things. So really, it just goes up. It's like powers, that video, powers of 10. It just gets harder and harder and harder and more complex. So we have to manage that complexity.
So one way to look at surface area for something like a city is to analyze it in terms of the cyberspace planes. And this is a framework that we've used to analyze different cyber infrastructure in some of our recent research over the last couple of years. So with the planes at the very top, you have the supervisory plane, which includes people and processes that might provide command and control over other lower elements of cyberspace. You have the persona plane, which is you know, think network personas, login names, email addresses, even social media presences. Below that, you have the logical plane. So you have layers 2 through 7 of the OSI model, operating system and application software, device drivers, network, different network protocols and packets. Below that is the physical plane, so layer 1 devices, routers, switches, cables, et cetera. And then the geographic plane really describes the physical location of some of those network devices, which is often relevant. So something that's different about cities than with other network infrastructures is you have this very heavy influence of politics really at all the planes. Particularly though, we see politics at play at the supervisory plane. So you're likely to have, a city is going to be influenced by state and federal governments applying pressure at various points in the supervisory plane. There are various forms of municipal government. So each city is sort of organized in its own way. Here we have a sample organizational diagram for a city. And you have this combination of elected officials and appointed officials, and that's going to cause tensions between different factions within the city government. Here, this picture shows a city manager, a council manager style of municipal government. And in this picture, the police chief, reports through the city manager to the city council. You could imagine, though, in a city that has a particularly strong police force, for example, that the police chief really may sort of own his own little fiefdom and doesn't feel like he reports to anybody, even though the organizational chart, shows him beholden to the city manager. So again, elected officials and appointed officials. The appointed officials are obviously beholden to the elected officials who put them in place, and then you have elected officials who are concerned about pleasing the constituency, so they continue to be elected officials. And then you can imagine these silos of excellence, right? So you have all these different infrastructure sectors and various government agencies and private entities. They all have their own network, little silos, some of which are better secured than others. And this diagram is just sort of designed to evoke what those silos look like from the top down. And you have all these very complex interdependencies between all the silos. So even if some of them are very well secured, you can imagine that others are less well secured, and then you have sort of this weakest link problem. If you take a step down a level to the persona plane, cities and other small governments tend toward openness, right? So they want the people to have access to the politicians. They publish a lot of information online. They have a very active social media presence. They're publishing email addresses and information about members of the city government, and all this could be a very rich source of information for a social engineering campaign. At the logical plane, again, you have interdependencies with systems that aren't necessarily very compatible. You're likely to have industrial control systems throughout the city IT infrastructure, more and more of which are connected to the internet, both for cost savings and for the purpose of convenience. And a lot of those industrial control systems are notoriously insecure. You also have city management software. So you have software that's specifically designed for cities to purchase and use to manage city operations. That's a software that has a fairly small user base, purchased by organizations that probably don't have big budgets. And it would be interesting, I think, to do a vulnerability assessment of some of this city management software. One example is the IBM Intelligent Operations Center. So here you have this tool that can be used to view city conditions, used to analyze citizens' social media sentiments. Really, it's sort of like a real world, Sim City playing out in real time right in front of you.
So a typical part of a pen test at the logical plane is to do a port scan. And so we figured we'd take a look at what services some of the major cities in the United States are running. Most of the major cities in the United States, it turns out, have provider-independent IP address spaces. And so it's pretty easy to find out what the range of IPs that the city government is using and take a look at what's in those IP address spaces. Sometimes city governments will have a website that's just running within that IP range. In other cases, consistently we found that there'll be some sort of, if they're using Akamai or some sort of hosting service for their website, that they'll have like a web app behind that website that's doing something like letting people pay traffic tickets or some other bureaucratic city process, and the web app will be hosted on a machine that's in the provider independent space. So once you've got one IP in the space, you can go to the ARIN database and get get the whole IP block and see the entire IP address range for a given city. Oh, I have the clicker now. So this is a chart that shows you the TCP/IP services that are hosted on the internet by the 10 largest, by the city governments of the 10 largest metro areas in the United States. This data came from the Shodan database. So of course there's banner information and other things along with that data, and there's some pretty interesting stuff when you drill into the details. At the low end, of course, we expect to see lots of web servers. One of these cities has an IBM mainframe that's serving as an FTP server on the open internet. There's lots of off-brand SSH daemons, and there are a number of legacy web servers, a few instances of IIS version 6, which either runs on Windows XP or Windows 2003, which is still supported as a server OS, I think. And then, I found a number of Netscape Enterprise Server version 6.0, which was released in 2001. Moving up the chain, we expect to see VPN endpoints. That's, something we would anticipate finding, but there are other things we were surprised to see, like a printer, a directory server, a number of databases, some Windows PowerShell ports. In the case of Washington, D.C., there were a number of services over port 10,000 that we decided not to include in this chart because it just made the chart too much of an eye chart. But those ports included some ports associated with a video conferencing system. Drilling down from the logical plane to the physical plane, cities have a really interesting physical plane, particularly from a wireless perspective. The cities have traditionally used wireless to communicate with and to coordinate operations across a large physical area. They've got, police and other emergency services. They've got maintenance people, garbage trucks, et cetera. All these people communicate over wireless networks. A lot of this stuff is becoming computerized. There are wireless emergency coordination and broadcast systems. And then these smart cities initiatives are bringing a whole bunch of new technology online. Often it's either in the 2.5 gigahertz or 5.4 gigahertz bands. And a lot of this stuff is getting deployed, without encryption or with encryption that is very poorly architected. There's a really interesting wireless spectrum analysis problem associated with pen testing a city. At the same time, we're kind of seeing this renaissance in terms of tools that are available to people in our community that enable us to audit the wireless spectrum. I went out and spent $20 and got this little USB key that enables me to do spectrum analysis up to 1.6 gigahertz using an app on my Android phone. So that's really awesome. And in fact, there's a whole lot of people playing with this at DEF CON in the wireless village. There's sort of this renaissance happening where on the one hand, we're seeing all this smart city infrastructure get deployed with all these wireless protocols that are interesting. And we as a community are getting a bunch of new tools that enable us to investigate and research and hack that stuff. So, I think there's going to be lots of interesting developments over time in this area. Below the physical plane, we have the geographic plane. The geographic plane is relevant in the context of cities for two reasons. The first is that you may have to deploy something in a particular location because that's where the city is. It's not your fault that hundreds of years ago, people decided to settle in a tsunami subduction zone. That happens to be where you are, and you're going to have your computers there, even though you would rather put them up in the hills where they're safer. So that's a challenge that cities have to contend with. The second issue is that when you think about pen testing a corporation, usually they have property that you can't trespass on, and all of their infrastructure is inside that property. So from the outside, you have some physical access challenges, but we live inside of cities and we have to be allowed into them. And the infrastructure is kind of built up around us in a city. And that means that we can get physical access to it in ways that sometimes we can't when we're looking at a sort of a corporate infrastructure. And so that's relevant, and it leads to threat models and attacks that don't necessarily exist for most organizations. So with respect to the sort of point vulnerabilities that exist in these systems, there's been a ton of research that's been presented on this stage and at DEF CON over the years and at other HackerCons that demonstrate point vulnerabilities in systems that are popular in cities. A couple of prominent examples, Cesar Carruto's excellent research last year on hacking traffic lights. So there are these traffic lights that communicate with vehicle sensors over a wireless protocol that has no encryption. And so you can spoof the messages and turn the lights on and off. He's also looked at smart street lamps. There was a talk on bad wireless encryption for municipal surveillance systems, so that you can get access to cameras or turn on these things have speakers that allow you to talk to people. So you can talk to people who are around the cameras. There was a really good talk at Black Hat Europe a couple years ago where these guys got a smart meter off their house, and it used a wireless mesh network to communicate. And it was the encryption was done with a fixed AES key that was stored in the EEPROM. And so they were able to get dump the EEPROM and get the AES key out. And using that key, they could send messages to everyone's house, turning the power off. So there's tons of vulnerabilities that have been discussed at these conferences over the years that you're going to find when you audit real cities, and increasingly as some of this new technology gets deployed. So once you've looked at the surface area and you understand the point vulnerabilities, we got to get to the next step, which is I think unique to these really complicated infrastructures, where we need to consider the intersections between all of those vulnerable components and try to figure out where we could have a problem with a domino effect.
And so the cross-sectioning is all about identifying interdependencies between all these various networks and systems. And so you can imagine that if someone were to try to take malicious actions against the city's network, there's some effects that they're going to achieve, and then those effects have second and third order effects that cascade from there, and not only cascade directly down a single path, but sort of could cascade exponentially out on several different paths. Fortunately, there is a fairly strong body of work on interdependency modeling, at least for critical infrastructure sectors. So here's an example of some of that work, and this image shows an analysis of interdependencies between a handful of infrastructure sectors. So here you have individual planes that represent infrastructure sectors, then parallel lines represent subsets of the infrastructure, nodes represent key components, and then the dotted lines show some of the interdependencies. And so, for example, in this image, you might have an electrical substation failure on the energy plane that causes a sewer pumping station to fail on the water plane, that then leads to city roads being flooded and being disrupted on the transportation plane. So with this sort of more broad understanding of what the different interdependencies are, then you can start to think about prioritizing where you want to put your cybersecurity effort. This it just shows another way to sort of graphically think through those different interdependencies. And now, once we've analyzed the interdependencies, we can take a look at the cascading consequences, right? So we can think of individual events that might have cascading consequences, down a variety of different paths. And if you can draw, you can draw some conclusions based on this sort of analysis to again think about the prioritization. So again, a fairly robust body of research. Again, it's sort of focused on the critical infrastructure sectors, and really mostly done for disaster planning sorts of scenarios, but here's some references to some work that's been done, and these slides will be available eventually, I'm sure, on the Black Hat website. So now that we've put some thought into the way these different individual silos are interconnected, now we can start to think about some of those pressure points, so places where you might be able to push on something that causes these ripple effects throughout a city's infrastructure. And the way we like to think about that is using this thing that we call a center of gravity analysis, and this draws from military doctrine. So the center of gravity is the source of strength for an entity or for an organization. And if you think of cities, cities have their individual centers of strength, right? So if you think of New York City, you have the financial sector that is a source of strength for the city. In Orlando, you have the amusement park business. God forbid if Denver were to lose the legalized marijuana industry, And then, of course, here in Las Vegas, we have the gambling industry as a center of strength. So various centers of gravity, industry-related centers of gravity in different cities. And then you have the critical infrastructure sectors, right? So this is the list of 16 critical infrastructure sectors from DHS. And all cities have some of these, some cities have all of these. And there are certain things you could cause to happen in different infrastructure sectors that could cause some serious cascading effects. And then we should also think about the non-critical infrastructure, right? So you have churches, you have sports facilities, theaters, local banks, law offices, things that could have a large impact if they were to be adversely affected in a metropolitan area. And this isn't just hyperbole. So there are recent relevant examples of city centers of gravity being attacked from cyber, being targeted by cyber actors. And here are just a list of a few. So you have the Sony hack, you have the Sands Casino hack last year, Saudi Aramco, NASDAQ in 2010. And so each one of these were fairly small scale attacks, but you can imagine if there were not only a large scale attack on a city's center of gravity, but a large scale attack coupled with some attacks in some critical infrastructure sectors, you can imagine these cascading failures sort of causing ripples throughout the whole place.
So once we have identified these pressure points and we understand where the centers of gravity are, we need to perform a risk analysis. And the basis of this risk analysis is not dissimilar from what we need to do in a regular technical pen test of a private company. We need to look at the different threat actors that these organizations face, and we need to consider, what motivations those threat actors have, what capabilities those threat actors have. Do they have the ability to exploit a particular vulnerability? I also think it's important to think about the typical MO of that group. And how they usually operate, because they're likely to do things in the future that they have done in the past. Things that are huge pivots for them are less likely to occur, even if they're within their capabilities. And also what the life cycle of their attack, what the frequency of their attacks are, and that enables us to predict how likely a particular event is to happen in the future. There are a few conclusions that this sort of general conclusions that this sort of risk analysis process implies for cities. The first is that you can be a small city that's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and kind of think of yourself as off the beaten path, and still be a target internationally for computer attacks, because on the internet everything is just as connected, and so you're just as accessible as Los Angeles from a computer perspective, and so that's something that sometimes catches people off guard. Another fact is that we can we can have infrastructure that's vulnerable, that sits out there for a long period of time, that without necessarily having anything bad happen. I tend to think about the way that people tend to settle in earthquake-prone regions or regions that are subject to tsunamis, and they can live there for years and years and years before they have a bad day. And when you think of we know that there's lots of security issues with water treatment plants, for example. There's lots of, if you look at ICS CERT, they've reported that there's lots of problems with those systems being directly connected to the internet. We know those systems have security vulnerabilities. People in this community have talked about it for years. But the problem is that no one cares. Financially motivated attackers are not interested in attacking, water treatment facilities. Maybe there's a ransomware scenario, but it would be a lot of work for them to get that software and set it up themselves and find, a good attack scenario that they could reproduce against people. And so they just don't bother. They've got other MOs. They've got other things that they're doing to generate money. And so those things can sit out there for a long time without something bad happening to them. But a nation state has the ability to get access to that software, has the ability to find out, come up with an attack scenario against it, may have a motivation to do so. And nation states operate on a different time scale. And so it's not something that's going to happen next week. It's not something that's going to happen next year, but it is something that may happen eventually. And so, I think that the problem is that the longer time goes on, the higher the probability of these events kind of occurring. I want to make one other observation about this, and that is that, when I think of the cross-section and pressure point analysis that Dave just took us through, I really think about the OPM breach. And what I'm about to say here, is a personal comment that may or may not reflect the opinions of my co-presenters. That particular data set is obviously a data set. The compromise of that data set is something that has widespread implications for the federal government in the United States. It is a pressure point that is having cascading effects. And we know that there are threat actors out there that have a regular attack life cycle who target identity caches. We've had multiple identity caches stolen from all kinds of different organizations by sophisticated threat actors over time. And so when you consider the sort of analysis that we're talking about, the idea that that particular data set would have been targeted is a pretty predictable thing. The question is, like, who is looking at the federal government of the United States across the board and asking, what are the pressure points, what are the centers of gravity that could have widespread consequences, and who's responsible for prioritizing those things? A lot of people are satisfied that the bureaucrat who was responsible for operating that agency resigned and has been replaced with a different Washington bureaucrat. But I don't personally find that it to be satisfactory. I don't think that solves the problem that we have, which is a systemic risk problem that exists at a different level of abstraction. Moving on from my personal editorial opinions, what do we need to do to solve this problem? It's obviously a very complicated problem. One of the people that we spoke to who's responsible for security in a major city said, I treat my city like a company, and I operate, using the practices that I would operate if I was trying to protect a company. Often that can be effective. You treat each department of the city government as a business entity, business unit, and you set standards and you get everyone communicating, and you come up with the same sort of things that you would if you were operating in a business. There are, however, differences, and at particular scales, those differences can have a bigger effect. The one key difference, which Dave talked about, is the fact that you are operated by politicians who have a tendency to get reelected or not get reelected. And so when you get a new politician, they may have different priorities. They may have a different understanding of the significance of computer security as a priority. And so that can cause budgets to shift. That can cause the architecture to change underneath you in a way that is probably less predictable than you would find in a company. And so as we talked to people that operated security in different cities, we came up with this hypothesis. And that is that there might be a sweet spot where, if you're too small and you're too remote, chances are you have a lot of difficulty recruiting and training people that know things about computer security. You probably have difficulty coming up with a budget for working on computer security. At the same time, if you're a big city, you've got all these departments, you've got all these fiefdoms, you've got different people running their own IT departments with their own technologies in their own way. They don't necessarily want to cooperate with each other. And so you've got a lot of cats to herd, and it can be very difficult to manage. There may be a sweet spot of cities that are about in the middle that have the resources and are big enough to attract talented InfoSec professionals, but at the same time, are not so complicated that it's difficult to wrap your hands around. It's possible to get everyone beating to the same drum. And the implication of this hypothesis is that cities of different sizes need different things. Cities that are remote, may still be targets of attacks over the internet, and they need technical help. They don't know what to do, and they don't have people who can do it. On the other side of the spectrum, major cities, may need better leadership. They need leadership that understands that this is a priority and have the political influence to get everybody in all these different departments working together and communicating together. So one of the things that we think, needs to be developed is a capability maturity model for cities from a security standpoint that talks about, how well coordinated and how prepared cities are to deal with security incidents, how well incident response teams in different parts of the city communicate with each other, how good that city is at just protecting and locking down the infrastructure that it has. We think there's probably a good conference talk in this capability maturity model if someone's interested in developing it. Another thing that's happening out there, which we think is really interesting, is the Securing Smart Cities initiative. There's a number of companies and folks here at this conference who are really interested in the risks that are posed by some of this smart cities technology that's getting deployed out there. They would like to see more work done on protecting that, and they're trying to raise awareness. There's some really good research papers up on their website, and we definitely think it's worth checking out. One of the thoughts that we had as we looked at this problem, particularly the smart cities problem, is that there's a need for broadband war driving. We've been war driving the 802.11 spectrum for 15 years or something, but that's just a little piece of the picture. We really need to be able to see, and in order for cities to protect themselves, they need to be able to see the entire spectrum. And when you're talking about these Zigbee transmitters, they're pretty low power, and so it's very difficult to identify low power transmitters over a big physical area. And so we need new strategies. One strategy is the possibility of crowdsourcing this data. I can get a device for $20 that lets me do spectrum analysis. So if lots of us have them, then we can start posting things to a database somewhere. And there actually is a pretty interesting project I learned about yesterday where people are beginning to do Zigbee war driving and posting it on a database online. Another idea, if the city wanted to take things into their own hands that I had is you could put spectrum analysis equipment inside of police cars, because police cars drive everywhere, and so eventually you'll collect data about all of the transmitters that are in your municipality. Now, this idea might be a little controversial to have a spectrum analysis device inside of a police car that's collecting data about transmitters. There could be some sensitive information and unique MAC addresses and things like that associated with private citizens, and perhaps that data would end up getting used for law enforcement purposes. And so there's probably an interesting dialogue there about, like, is that idea dangerous? Is it a good idea? What should we be doing? And so I think that this is an area where there's a need for new tools and some new projects. I think that the UI on my app is designed for listening to the radio. It's not really designed for spectrum analysis. I'd love to see some more apps that support these software-defined radios that are really designed for this kind of work. So I think there's a lot of really cool projects and a lot of opportunities for some cool hacking to do in this area.
Another strategy is the use of simulation exercises. I mean, there are homeland defense type exercises that go on now, but I'm thinking about continuing that and refining that and focusing on information security in particular. And I particularly like the idea of combining it with some physical or physical manifestation of the results. So when you have these exercises, and they can be lightweight, they can be something like a communications exercise that just tells people who to call in certain circumstances, and they practice those, all the way down to very deep dive exercises, perhaps from the packet level up. I like the idea of a physical manifestation. You may be familiar with SANS' Cyber City project that has underlying critical infrastructure and allows people to do exercises on the underlying critical infrastructure sector, but you get real world responses from the miniaturized city. I can envision a day where a city could have like a small version of itself that they would use to conduct these exercises. Another would be the efforts out at the Michigan Cyber Range, and then if there's an opportunity to come up with a virtualized solution that would allow people to do these type of exercises in a very scalable way. And given the political motivations required to affect change, the work of the information security community to raise public awareness and gain media attention that gets then voters concerned is, I think, a necessary aspect of helping secure cities. Would also point to Estonia. When you think about Estonia is smaller. Estonia, the nation, is smaller than many United States cities. But it takes it, they've learned their lessons from their really the major attack that they suffered. So they've got, they're building in information security into the backbone of what they do. Right, it's not an afterthought. And there's a nice article on their model for e-government in the Communications of the ACM June 2015 edition. So if it's something that you're interested in, and that I'd recommend that to you. We had to put that in there. Okay, and with that, I think any parting comments?
Yeah, let's now.
Okay, we'll take some questions. Thanks.
Is there a microphone Microphones.
I don't know. Someone's got their hand raised. It's really hard for us to see, so just go ahead.
So when you first started the presentation, it seemed like it was something you've actually embarked on. It didn't kind of seem like it was more theoretical. Like, is it something the commission started looking at in depth? Like maybe the commission by a city, perhaps, to start looking at your infrastructure? Or is this theoretical?
So what we've done is we're really not at liberty to discuss the specific cities. It's kind of a standard practice, right? But we've worked with several large cities and have been helping them design. So basically talked about with their problems, helping them design the exercises, kind of a top-down approach. And then Tom's taken a bottom-up approach to gather information. But do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, well, so, I think that let's put it this way. Different cities are at different levels of sophistication with respect to this. We did a couple of the cities that we were talking to were trying to look at like doing across the board pen testing, or they had just begun to do so. And so like really what we're trying to do is provide a framework for people to organize that work and to think about what they need to do.
So I guess I might be the next to ask a question. Just kind of a brief one, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but with the idea of, out of EMS, telecom, trash collection, especially trash collection because they drive everywhere, out of all the different entities within a city that drive all over the place, you selected police. Man, what's wrong with you?
We did have this internal discussion. Tom, would you like to field that question?
I don't know. It's what occurred to me.
I like garbage trucks.
Garbage trucks is a good one. They go
That's what came to my mind, too.
Garbage trucks are not always municipal. Some people have private garbage collection.
That's a good point.
I don't know, whatever. Yeah, I think that there are interesting controversial questions that raises, and I think it's an interesting discussion, which I'd be happy to have over beer once this is over.
if you're buying.
With regard to crowdsourcing, the spectrum analysis, the war driving, what's your experience and expectation of the municipal response to that? In some jurisdictions, it's illegal.
Right. I mean, so it goes back to the comment that I made that we see cities that are all over the board from a sophistication standpoint. Perhaps that was clear in the diagram of TCP/IP services I put up there, and we see cities that like within a city you have different organizations that are all over the board from a sophistication standpoint. And so certainly one of the stages of coming to terms with information security is the stage where you start shooting the messenger. And so yeah, I mean absolutely, like going around doing wireless war driving is going to provoke some people, but I guess taking them through the process of being provoked and reaching acceptance that this is a reality is part of how we get people to do the right things, maybe. So, perhaps it's a good thing that we provoke them sometimes.
Have you been doing anything with foreign cities? Shell has this global initiative on smart cities. Singapore's look on smart governance. Tokyo's getting really worried about the Olympics in 2020. Yep. There should be a really big market out there for this.
Yeah, so we did talk to some overseas journalists yesterday about some of this, and it does seem that internationally there are some countries that just sort of feel like this isn't as big a problem as it is in the United States. They feel like their government entities and infrastructure sectors cooperate better than maybe we do. I don't know to the extent to which that is true. Maybe the case may not be, but I agree. I think cities that have upcoming huge events like Olympics or World Cup or et cetera. This I think is a good way to sort of analyze one aspect of the security for those large-scale events.
Yeah, so to add to what you're saying, I definitely think that the Japanese government is taking information security around the Olympics very seriously. It seems to be that there are a bunch of initiatives that they've launched around that and around incident response and the like. And also, to further your point, the smart cities initiatives are really seem to be taking off in Europe, where people seem to be a little bit more concerned with energy conservation than they are in the United States. And so, a lot of that infrastructure is getting deployed over there, and a lot of the vulnerabilities are propping up over there. So you're probably going to see some of those things unfold there before you see them unfold here.
So just one other thing, in terms of the pushback in terms of monitoring. Why is the spectrum monitoring more, say, of a touch point than Google driving around doing its mapping?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing, right? Because they were war driving as they mapped, and they got in trouble because I guess they were collecting clear text Wi-Fi packets, and so arguably they were wiretapping, and so clearly, like if you're going to do that, then you need to avoid collecting content. But knowing that the transmitter is there and knowing what kind of transmitter it is not content information. But these are the kinds of things that need to be sussed out in order to run an operation like this. And obviously, Google is a very savvy company when it comes to technology, and they ran afoul of this. So it's obviously to a minefield to a certain extent, and people need to understand the issues when they proceed with it. And that's basically the reason that I'm saying it needs to be a discussion.
So I'd also add the idea of a business opportunity. I do sense that there's a market if for organizations or penetration testers to think the next level of scale. Now, I don't know how much money cities have to actually hire penetration testing firms, but I think cities are increasingly becoming interested. So it looks like we're out of time, and I see a black and white zero being held up at us. So we'll go ahead and end here, and we're happy to
Thank you very much for coming to our talk.
Thank you very
Awesome.
much.
Thanks.